Space. Gerald had always heard of space. He'd seen studies on it. But as the carriage rattled around the hub and descended rapidly, he contemplated the possibility, the chance that he would have to actually see it. Touch it even. Far off in the distance from the hub, he could see his home country, even guess as to where his city was. But the light coming through the globe's crust made the exact province difficult to pinpoint. He'd never been this far from home, never even visited the central planetary hub. Now that he was up this far, he could see the thin layers of crust around the globe, and some of the shapes they made much more clearly. Several hours later, Gerald and his classmates stepped out into the soft, spongy grass of the field, looking out over the vast lake of space. The instructor began as soon as all the students exited. The spatial lake was formed by accident when our scientists, in an effort to better understand the universe we live in, delved too deep through the crust, puncturing a small hole through. The hole was only the size of a newborn's pinky toe, yet the pressure exerted from the outside allowed space to flow into the globe at a speed of 170 gallons per second. The stream of space shot nearly halfway through the globe, coming back down to form what you see before you. They sealed the hole fairly quickly, but it has essentially halted all other attempts to explore the universe outside our own globe. Scientists are now researching a method to pump the space back out of the globe, and if they are able to do so, they may be able to create a two-stage system allowing people to explore the depths of space without flooding our planet. Gerald stepped slowly closer to the spatial lake and reached down, as did several other students. "It's quite all right," the instructor said, wading into the lake. "People come in this lake all the time and it has no adverse effects. Don't go too deep, though, because the substance is not breathable." Gerald stepped in, seeing the space swarm around his feet. It felt slightly warmer than the air, and as he waded in, he felt his feet start to drag, the humid air giving way to the dense space.
Welcome to the Wonderful World of Creation, podcast where we share things about stories and world building to help anyone who happens to want to work on those things.
This is a writer's resource. The other podcasts that we do are also writer's resources, but they're more discussion based in the sense that, like with the Knights Table, it's a round table, multiple people. We discuss ideas that have already been portrayed and the concepts behind them. With Metagamers Anonymous, it's basically gamer related. This podcast is world specific, like building a world, building a continent, building races of people, all the little details that good writers do well and bad writers don't.
And everyone in between occasionally wants to rip their hair out of their head while they're attempting to do it.
Yes, exactly. What we want to do is we want to make this easier by discussing the intricacies that go into it, our own experiences in world building, and how we've gotten to where we are. So, what you've just listened to is a world that we just came up with in a discussion one night, and I thought it was a really cool concept. It's a bubble world. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, but we're going to talk about the dynamics of how our group discussion came to that conclusion. But first of all, I'm Joster.
I'm Sylvath. And I'm Xana.
And we're the only three that are recording this week. We may bring other people in over time as like special guests or anything like that.
But we're more fun.
Yeah. we would like to keep this group a little bit smaller because there's a lot to go over, and with a large group, it's harder to do that. So we'll keep it small, we'll keep it local. So if you're not in the South, you can't listen to this. All right. So the concepts that we want to discuss are, first and foremost, when you're creating a world, and what we're talking about is creating the actual location, the planet, the island, the continent, the mountain.
The place where you're having things happen.
Yes, exactly. The way that I build worlds is I build them big. I build entire planets. I build entire continents. My story may take place in just one city, but there's other things going on in the world, and I like my stories to encompass. A person walks into a restaurant and overhears a couple that's having a conversation about something that's happening, and they see that throughout. There's a war going on, so people talk about it. But I like to start big because it's easier to start big and then come down. But first of all, you have to start.
And I do just the opposite of what Joster does. I actually start small. Like, I know specific locations. I want things to happen. I have a tendency to just see a scene in my head. So I know I need this location. And then I like to take it and broaden it out because that works easier for me. So you don't just have to do this one way.
Right, exactly. And there is multiple ways to do this.
I haven't made more than one world, but I've made the same world more than once.
Yep.
For different purposes. And I actually do the same as Salah. I'm thinking about switching over to building the world first, but like physically, like the picture in my head, I have to have the original picture to be what it's going to be altogether. So I'm thinking I'm going to need to buy like a toy ball or something and draw the map on it. Because otherwise it's a flat world, and then I'm like, well, I can't convert this into a globe,
Yep.
And
that's actually one of the things that you want to talk about, or that we want to talk about, is what do you start with? You start with the basics. You start with, okay, do you have a world? Does this planet have a core? What's the temperature like? And whether you start big or you start small, those are kind of important details.
And you've also got the question of, is it even a planet at all?
Yeah.
Because, like, for instance, with Discworld, it's not actually a planet. It's a flat disc that is on the backs of elephants, on the back of a giant space turtle.
Right.
I love the giant space turtle.
So, when you look at books and movies that have like this just far out weird concept for how things function, Discworld, for example, what keeps them from flying off the side? What keeps them from, do they eventually develop flight?
I think they do. In one of the the book one of our friends let me borrow, they actually have a flying machine that, when I was glancing through it, he called it a kite. But it's a big old thing, and it's got, like, if I remember right, it's got dragons attached to it. And that's how they're getting pulled along through the thing. But otherwise, not like our standard flight in this world.
Okay. Because that leads to a whole slew of other questions. How high up is their atmosphere? What's actually generating the atmosphere? Can they fly below the disk? And I think at one point they actually do lower themselves down so they can see.
They built a machine that is kind of like I picture it when I read it was like the box that they have Kida in Atlantis, the Lost Empire. Yeah. And they put someone in it and they lowered it over the edge of the disk on a giant chain so they could see what was off the edge of the world.
Yeah. So these are a lot of questions, and the book actually answers them. Based on my experience with it, it's fairly comprehensive. Tolkien, very good storyteller, very, very good world builder. He explains so much. For those of you who have read the Silmarillion, it's a hard read. If you read the Silmarillion and the dictionary simultaneously, it'll be about the same. And I'm not saying that the Silmarillion just defines things, but it's a very difficult read because it goes into depth into how much Tolkien built the world. But if you can manage through it, you'll find a lot more details, and they'll stick out when you read the books. But where do you start? You start with what you know. You start with what you understand.
If you have a planet that's kind of like ours and it has tectonic plates, then you want to be able to kind of outline where they are so you'll know where the mountain ranges are and where islands might be.
So, like, you can build your land masses from underneath, right?
Right.
When you're looking at building a world, you wanna kind of draw it out, and you may not be the best at drawing, and that's fine.
No one else is gonna see it.
Yeah, I'm terrible at drawing. What I do when I actually design planets, continents, stuff like that, I do it on a 3D SketchUp. I use Google SketchUp, and I'll do angles that indicate where my mountain ranges are. And then as I fill out the rest of the continent, I can then lift those up and actually make mountains out of them. So if I have a volcano, I actually draw the mountain range first, lift the mountain, and then concave the top of it to make the volcano. If that's the way that it works best for you, great, do it. If not, if you prefer to do it pen and paper, do that. If a computer works better for you, and like a Photoshop or anything like that, do what works for you. Use the resources that you understand and build based off of what you understand of the world.
Because not everything is always going to line up with our world. Joster and I both have two separate stories that have different reasons, that certain areas in the story have different reasonings for having mountains or hills besides tectonic plates or earthquakes or your standard things that would make them. In my story, because it's actually got a whole bunch of different planets that I can't even begin to go into, but in one of the planets, in the specific area that my team of characters ends up in, the reason it's a mountainous area, because the area is originally all desert, so theoretically there shouldn't be mountains there, is because a specific species built it up from underground to have labs and different things. So they're technically man-made mountains. You just wouldn't know that unless you had known the species had been there.
Right. Using this, let's talk a little bit about like the globe in the story. Right. So the concept in that globe was it was an air pocket. It was a bubble in space.
Kind of like a snow globe.
Yeah, exactly. It was a snow globe in space that was formed in fluidic space. So space is fluid, and these pockets that form in them can develop life. The first thing that, as I'm sure you noticed, the people there speak English, because at the time that I was writing that, I mean, I'm adding an entirely new concept here. It may not be new. Maybe somebody's done this before, but I'm adding in a concept that I have never used before. I didn't want to overcomplicate it, so I didn't make up a whole new language. I didn't make up a whole new body structure. They were bipedal. They had 2 arms, 2 legs. I made it real simple.
The kiss analogy is very good for starting out. Just keep it simple, stupid.
Yep. The concept is that you should be able to explain your idea to like a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old, something like that. You should be able to explain your idea to a kid, and they should be able to understand the basic fundamentals of it. If you can't explain it to a kid, if they get lost partway through, you've overdone it. Now, Tolkien, if he explained his concepts to a kid, like all of them, it would be very complicated. It would be very complex. Yeah, he made a kids movie out of it. The Hobbit was originally a cartoon, and it was very good.
And he was originally coming up with the stories to tell his children at bedtime. So really, his approach wasn't over complex. He had a way to explain all of it without getting into the intense details. But yet, if he wanted the intense details, he could have them without making them necessity.
And see, that's the key, is he started simple and then made it progressively more complex. So you start with what you know, and you don't stress over details that you don't need. I didn't make a whole new language for the globe because we didn't need to. That whole concept, that whole bit that you listened to, it was to illustrate the physical aspects of the planet. Now, if you want to throw interesting little tidbits in, do it.
Like the first time, like I said, I made one world multiple times. The first time I made it, it was like a parallel to this world, and like you could access it through certain points, like using magic. If you had, like, there in the story, there were people that had capacity for magic, and the rest of the world didn't. Those that had the capacity for magic were able to open up portals into this other world. And so when the mass exodus happened, which was because of the anticipated witch trials and all this stuff, which when the mass exodus happened, they all came from different parts of the world. And so there are parts of the parallel world that have, basically, they're like I guess the equivalents of this world. And so there are different sections of the world that speak the same languages that our world has.
Right.
Just in a different order, or like in different like combinations. So because it happened so long ago, some of the languages have mixed more thoroughly than here.
That makes sense. And that's one of the important things, is make sense of your world. If it doesn't make sense to you, you can't write in it.
Yeah, and it's definitely not going to make sense to anybody else if it doesn't make sense to you.
Yeah. One of the biggest problems that you see in the movie industry is when people make movies out of concepts that they don't understand but that think are really cool.
Yeah, and then it just leaves the audience with massive questions. Or occasionally when you have, sticking with the movie thought, when you have a book that's turned into a movie and there's massive details left out of the movie to make up for time. Also, you get so confused, because I don't remember which Harry Potter movie it was. It might have been the 4th or the 5th. I can't remember what. I spent most of the time in the theater explaining to my mom what was happening, because I had read the books and she didn't. So I was like, well, what you don't know and they didn't put in here was this, this, and this happened, which is how we're here now.
Right. And that's something that also you don't get, like, you'll get that kind of stuff from, like, let's say directors that haven't read the books, or people who don't have, like, a full grasp of the books.
Mm-hmm. Or you got the ones that have read the books so thoroughly, they just assume everyone knows this thing, so it's not necessary to put in the movie.
Right.
Or directors that want to put their own perspective onto things. I remember watching one of the special features in I think it was the second Twilight. Anyways, the point being, she wanted to make it more sensual. In the book, it was not sensual.
Not even a little bit.
Both of them, like, they were both really restrained in the books. But this director wanted to make them closer and all that. Completely wrecked most of what I understood the story to be, because that was not the relationship that they had.
Not even remotely.
But yeah, that's one of the things. You have to understand your story. You have to understand your world in order for it to make sense when you put it into story form, when you tell a story from it. So, for example, with this globe planet, we have a fluidic space. As the author, if I were to write a story based off of that, I have to understand several aspects. I have to understand how they're being held to the surface of it. Because gravity, mass is everywhere. Fluidic space is everywhere. There's no center of gravity like there is on a standard planet.
And you also have to decide whether or not there's a globe inside this globe.
Right.
Or how the land masses even are within the globe.
In the globe in the story, there was no center landmass. So it was, you could, the central city, or the central planetary hub, was in the center of the globe, and they had devised ways to get to there, and basically that was how they traveled. They would go from their location up to the center of the globe, and then down whichever shaft they needed to reach their destination. I have to understand, as the author, how all that works. I don't have to put that in the story, but I have to know it. And that's why, like you had mentioned earlier when we were planning this podcast, that's why a lot of people build planets like Earth.
Because it's the simplest and it's what they know.
Yeah, exactly. And there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to change up everything. You don't even have to change anything. A lot of people write really good stories that are based in this world in a city that they have visited.
And like my creative writing teacher said, if it can happen in this world, why not set it in this world?
Yeah, exactly. Because then there's less details that you have to really understand.
And there's less stuff you have to explain to the readers.
Exactly.
Because like one of my favorite novel series is actually, it's set on Earth, set in present time, like she even lists what year it is.
Right.
And it is almost exclusively in New Orleans.
Yeah. Yep.
And she has so many books, and they're all different, and they are fantastic.
On the other side of that, though, don't be afraid to put something new in your story. Don't be afraid to try a new concept. If you want to attempt anti-gravity, where people are being held to this planet by some other force.
By tethers.
Yeah, by tethers. People
We're
are
all
tethered
on
to the
leashes.
planet. Yeah.
Or have, like, the giant boots like the one girl does in Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children.
Yeah,
Maybe that's how they're held to the ground.
exactly.
Magnetic boots.
Yes, magnetic boots. In the globe that we were talking about in the story, basically the idea that I have is fluidic space is magnetic, and in their bone structures there's fine residue of metallic substance that makes up their actual bone structure. It's not like they've been laced with metal or anything like that. It's built in. It's part of their genetic structure. And so by the magnetism of the fluidic space that surrounds the globe, wherever they are at, they are held to the surface. And not like massively held. It's not like a massive magnetic pull. It would be like being here on Earth. That kind of gravitational pull. But as they get closer to the center, they now are being pulled in all directions. So it's the feeling of weightlessness. But it happens at the center of the globe, not when they enter space.
And is that why the space fluid was considered really dense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Now, as you heard in the story, they punctured a hole in the crust, and fluidic space started filling the globe, and they managed to stop it. But in the scientific world, that actually doesn't happen. If you have a bubble in the middle of the ocean, puncturing it doesn't do anything. Water doesn't start flowing into it. So how does that work? Well, my understanding of that explains it as well. And I'm not going to get into the details of that because of time. But I, as the author, understand why that worked. I, as the author, understand how fluidic space functions. And that's the important thing. As long as you, as the author, understand it, you're good. So don't be afraid to try something new, but don't feel pressured to go beyond your comfort zone.
And also, like Joster pointed out, don't worry about cramming every single detail of your understanding into the story, because then it'll turn from a story into basically an encyclopedia.
Yes.
Or a dictionary.
Yep.
And that neither you nor whoever else is going to be reading it really wants to read that. It's fabulous when people put the small things in it so you get a base understanding, like with Discworld, where they introduced right at the beginning, this is what the world's like, and this is what they know. But it doesn't tell you the real reality of the space turtle, or how it came into being. It doesn't tell you, how they're held on the disc right in the beginning. I don't know if it does in the later novels, because I haven't read them all. But it was enough information for you to get a basic grasp of what was going on and how some things functioned, and it was still unique.
Yep.
Without overloading the reader.
One of the things that you mentioned, Xana, is when you build a world, you build a history behind that world.
Oh yeah. Like, if I don't have something to go off of historically, then I don't have, any way to decide, which countries get along, which cultures stand out, and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. when you're building a history, like what's your process for doing that?
I kind of look at it on a geographic standpoint. I kind of look at like major land masses and landmass dividers, like mountain ranges and rivers and stuff like that. And for example, in the world that I recently like revamped, there are two main countries on this one continent, and right between them is this river. And like in my head, I'm like, okay, so if what it was they were fighting over land, and then at some point they had to come to an agreement that this river was the cutoff point, that the river itself is neutral ground. So like it depends on what I put there, and then I can start looking at like, okay, well, if I put a country here, how is this country going to have interacted with other countries or other civilizations at the time?
So when you say you build a history, you build the history first, and then you build the continent.
Or do you build like the like you say, okay, I want a country here and I want a country here, and now I need to figure out how they work and what their history is.
Right. And it depends on how I build it, because like if I build it like Slovath does, and I start with like one small thing and then I build it out from there. I started with this one country that like I've been writing stories for since like 9th grade. And then I started, okay, well, what other countries are there? Like, how far away are they? Are they on other islands, or is it a bigger landmass? So, like, my main one's always been, like, an island. Like, I liken it to the UK in my head, because it's kind of small, but it's not, like, teeny tiny.
It's not like Hawaii.
Yeah, right.
People can spread out.
Right. And then, like, I had a main landmass.
You had a main man.
A main man mass.
Yeah.
I had a main landmass, and I had named one of the countries, on the one closest to this island. I named it Desser, and I was like, okay, well, this is going to be like kind of an ally. And then I decided, because it was an ally, at some point there was a king who was being threatened by rebels or something, and so he decided he was going to recruit someone from this other country to help him, like, to stay safe. At the time, I had decided that there were certain people with certain, like, powers or whatever, so this particular person was, like, the only person who could see the future in both countries. And so he recruited that person to keep him safe from people who might have poisoned him, who might have attacked him in his castle, and things like that. And that was kind of how I decided, okay, this country's going to be buddy-buddy with this other country.
Right.
And I like that, because I struggle a lot with, like, writing the histories of places a lot. But I really like that, because then with the history, you can also further develop characters based on that history once you get to that point.
Right.
So I really like that. So that way you're not just like, whoop, pulling it out of thin air. Here's a character. Nothing's ever happened to him in his life, except for whatever I decide happened to him, and he lived in a vacuum. Right. So I really like that, because it helps you round out both your locations and your characters.
And see, like, I think you're like a happy medium between me and Slovath, because she starts with characters a lot. I start with worlds. So I start with worlds, I create continents, and then I populate them.
Right.
And then I fill in all the gaps of, okay, so I have this river that I just randomly decided to put in the middle of the continent. How would a culture wrap around that? How would they deal with it?
Right. And it would also depend on the environment around the river, because if the river is the only source of water within it would turn out a lot like Egypt. Mm-hmm. Whereas if it's like in the middle of what would be like the rainforest, mm-hmm. then it would have something like the Amazon.
So in one of my stories, I had a general idea. I had a map outline that had rivers and that had, you know, all this stuff. And when I created my characters, I created them based on what I had already designed. So when I created a character that had extremely high intellect and had basically gone beyond the point of other people around him, I put him on a river, which already existed. And when I put him there, I had a shop that ran off of a water wheel and all that. And then I also had another character that lived in mountain caves, except that the mountains weren't exactly close to where the river was. So in order for these two to visit, it was a long travel. And that added its own elements into the story. But the way that Sylvath does it...
I literally will end up having just a group of characters in my head. They're pretty much fully developed. I have their personality. Occasionally, I'll already have some cultural things about them that I know is specific to them and their people, or specific to them and what's currently going on around them. And then I take those characters and I try to build a world around them, which is occasionally really, really difficult for me because I'm so obsessed with the characters and their story that I have a harder time focusing outward onto the bigger details of the world around them.
And so when you were talking, that's why I said, you're a happy medium. Mm-hmm. You bring those two extremes together into one cohesive, functioning format.
Right. And it's easier for me to make a world that's kind of like this world because I can, the science behind why there are deserts in certain areas of the world is kind of what I use to base where I would have deserts in my world. So I don't remember the exact science, but it was the weather. You would have you would have clouds that would, the higher they went, the more condensation would gather, and then as it got to the top of the mountain, that's when everything would fall. And then by the time the air got over the mountain, it was already there was nothing left to fall.
Right.
So that side of the mountain is desert, and this side of the mountain is forest.
I think a fun little project for the three of us would be I create a world, you create cultures, and you populate it. That would be really fun just to see how it turns out.
To see what ended up happening. Or, if we did it reverse, took what each of us wasn't that great at, and, so you would populate it, because you sometimes struggle with characters.
That's true. That would be, and it would be really interesting to do both of those. 1 week do one, and then the next week do the other.
And see how it turns out.
Yeah, see what we came up with, because that would be really interesting, because I tend to struggle occasionally both with cultures and the world. Mm-hmm. So, I could do either one of those would be my weakness to work on.
Yeah. So, when you're designing your world, it's really fun to experiment. It's really fun to create new things. We tend to want to explain things in a scientific way,
right?
Because when you go out and you talk to people about an idea, and they're like, "Well, no, that wouldn't work because of this and this and this and this." Okay, but this is a fictional world, so this, and this, and this don't have to exist.
Yeah, I do what I
want. When we talk about trying something new, we literally try anything new.
And that's hard for me because my brain works in a logical manner. I go by the rules that I know and things that I know work.
Yeah.
Whereas I tend to stick to the standard stuff I know, the basics of Earth. I don't get all the fine intricacies. I don't understand a lot of the science, but I tend to stick to that. And then occasionally I'll also come up with something completely random. I have a desert planet that has 3 suns.
Now, the desert part totally makes sense.
Yeah, no, the desert is totally makes sense, but. The things I do know is they have 3 suns. One of them is much more deadly than the other 2, so that's when everybody that lives on the planet in that section tries to stay indoors.
So they don't have a daytime, nighttime. They have a daytime and extreme daytime.
Yeah, they have daytime. They have the evening before it gets dark, and then they have the extreme.
Right.
And, they ended up coming up with a superstition based on what they call their blood sun,
Right.
which is their worst sun. But yeah, I know they have no rainfall at all.
Mhm.
Like the world does not suck up. It doesn't have clouds and stuff like our world does, so they don't suck up water into the sky and it doesn't fall back down. All of their water is underneath the ground. All of it. That's what I know. I don't know how it works. I also don't know quite yet if the suns are circling the planet, if the suns are stationary and the planet's just spinning. I have no idea how that's working. I just know it has 3 suns and what time of day the people do not go out during.
This is still a work in progress, right?
Right.
So by the time you publish it, you're going to want to be able to explain that.
Right. And I mean, technically, theoretically, unless I have where my group travels to this planet, theoretically, I don't have to come up with that detail at all.
You have to know which it is. You have to know if the suns are circling or if the planet is just spinning.
Right.
But that's literally the only thing. And you can literally just flip a coin
And decide that.
and decide that. You don't have to get into the science of it.
Mm-mm. Do not take more detail than you need. Please don't make your brain explode when you come up with something you really, really like.
Now, in your story, you have a symbiotic relationship, right?
I do. 2 of my characters have a symbiotic relationship.
Do you know all of the science behind that?
No. I know very minimally what you and I worked out.
And that, like what you and I worked out, we're not going to get into the details of it here in the podcast because it's still a work in progress. But what you and I worked out is sufficient.
Yeah,
Because-
I don't need to know any more than that because honestly, if I went any deeper into it, I would cry and I'd end up hating it and I'd probably change it just because I didn't want to deal with the scientific fact in it.
Right. When you're creating a fictional story, you are creating fiction. It does not have to follow the rules of science. It has to follow the rules that you designate. I'm a DM in Dungeons and Dragons, which means I'm a dungeon master.
It's not as dirty as it sounds.
Yeah, it's not as dirty as it sounds. Most people, like some people call them GMs, game masters. Game master, dungeon master is basically the same thing.
Basically, he's the guy in charge of the game.
Yeah, well, I'm not in charge of the game so much as I am in charge of the world. And sometimes when you go into detail about this and this and this is happening, and players get into, well, this shouldn't be happening because this, and this shouldn't be happening because this, they're thinking from the rules of the world that we live in. And I, as the dungeon master, have to sometimes say, this is happening because it is what is happening. Because that's what's going on.
Because he says so.
Yes.
And also part of that where you were saying when you got into details about this is happening and this is happening and this is happening, and then people are like, well, this, and this shouldn't be happening because X, Y, Z, that also goes back to the fact about, don't overload the story.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
it'll immediately take away from the actual storyline. And then you won't actually be focused on the story, you'll be focused on the mechanics of what's going on.
Right.
Right. I was thinking, it was interesting that you said that, like, you want to keep it fun for you to write, because it's like, because you were actually talking about this with character creation. There was one night that Joster had us all create characters the way he creates them, and it's in a way that makes the character more fun to play. You're not creating a character, or you're not creating a world that's supposed to be perfect. It's going to have flaws. It's going to have things that you don't really expect when you first make it.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it fun.
When I do character creation, whenever I'm making a character for Dungeons and Dragons, in like the first step, when I'm picking my race, I decide how I'm going to play that race. If I'm going to play it according to how that race is typically played, or if I'm going to play it differently. And then as part of that, I decide at least one quirk. One thing that this creature does that's just weird. And when you're making a world...
That's actually not a bad basis to follow.
Yeah, exactly. Where I grew up in the mountains. out in Washington State, and there were thistles everywhere, pointlessly. They just spread all over the mountain. They were terrible. If you accidentally rubbed your arm against one, it hurt because they had spines everywhere. But we had this goat that absolutely loved eating those thistles. And it was the most random thing because none of it made any sense. We didn't know why there were so many thistles there, why they overran chamomile, because chamomile is like ground cover that's on steroids. Thistles would come right through it. And this goat was the most random goat because it would go and it would eat all these thistles. And so you have these two elements that are like quirks. And it's like, when the planet was being created, God said, I'm going to make these thistles and thorns everywhere, and I'm going to make goats eat them for fun. Why? Because I want to.
And that's totally okay to do in your world because, for instance, in reality, he grew up completely surrounded by thistles. I've never seen a thistle a day in my life. Mm-hmm. And so having those unique quirks don't just go for characters, it goes for your places too that are different. And you can go have one place be like, okay, this is the quirk I want for this place. Right. Whereas this place over here doesn't have anything like that, and they have this instead.
Yep.
Yeah. Like my sisters, my siblings and I, we all grew up in the South. And in the South, like all the dirt is red because there's clay everywhere. And so recently we went out west, and my sister's looking around and she's like, the dirt is brown. We're like, yeah, that's where everywhere else looks like this.
Yep.
We just live in a weird place.
Yep.
That's like, I've grown up on the East Coast, and when I went out west, I wanted to cry. There were not trees.
Yep.
Right.
I was like, it's too open, it's too big, I need trees.
Yep.
Why are there not trees everywhere I look?
And see, if you'd have gone farther west, if you'd have gone into Washington instead of like Utah, because Utah there's no trees. Washington is everywhere. Like you can get lost out there.
So I basically would have been at home.
Yeah. More so.
Yeah.
Because it's dense, it's evergreens, like it's crazy.
I just have this mental image of Washington, specifically from when I was reading Twilight, and they were talking about that in New Moon. She got like left in the forest,
yep.
And like that image in my head matched perfectly with the movie.
Right.
Like that was what I had in my head, and I was like, okay, that's really cool that like they were able to. That Stephanie Meyer was able to describe it so well that it was the same in real life.
Yeah. So when you're creating a world, give it quirks, give it little oddities.
Yeah. The thing with making it fun is if you don't make it fun, you're not going to want to keep writing in that world or using that world for whatever purpose you created it.
Right.
The first draft of your story is written for you.
Yes.
You are writing for you alone to enjoy it, which is why a lot of people say, don't let anyone read your first draft until it is finished, right. Because the first draft is for you.
Yep. When I'm writing, I write strictly information because that's how my brain works. I go based off of information. I go based off of I have this idea. I need to get it on paper. The faster I can get it on paper, the better it is because then the idea doesn't fade, it doesn't dissipate, it doesn't change. So you want to when you start designing your world, you want to get the overall picture down on paper as quickly as possible, because then you can go back and you can build off of that framework. It's like pouring a foundation. You don't pour a foundation over a couple of months. You pour the foundation all at once because otherwise it develops cracks, it separates, it doesn't set right.
And that doesn't matter whether you're flat out trying to write the story in one go, because some people do that, or you're more like me and you have an entire notebook dedicated to nothing but notes.
Right. The important thing is, if you're not enjoying writing something, you shouldn't be writing. So design your world so that it's fun. That it's fun for people to read about, and it's fun for you to fill with a story. Don't get caught up in the strict facts of your world. You're going to have people that look at your world, look at your idea, and are like, this doesn't work. And you just have to look at those people and say, yeah, it does.
And then you've also got the people that'll go, this is terrible. Which is not creative criticism.
No.
Not even a little bit.
It's not.
It's just rude.
Yeah.
Anybody, if you bring something to someone, if you present an idea to someone, and they say, "Well, that's just not a good idea. I wouldn't read that." Okay, well, they're not your target audience then.
Yeah.
If they wouldn't read it, you're not writing it for them.
And they're not the kind of people you should soundboard off for this particular idea either,
Right.
because they're not going to have the same interest in it that you are.
And that gets into our last topic. Collaboration is extremely important, particularly with novels. If you want to publish something, bounce it off people. And bounce it off people not only that you trust, but that you know will give you constructive criticism. You don't want people that just say, oh yeah, that sounds great.
And then leave it at that.
That was not information at all. The reason you bring it to someone is so that they can respond to you. When Sylvath and I talk about her books or my books, she doesn't just read her stuff to me and then I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds great. She reads it to me and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. What does this mean? What is this about? Because the point of us collaborating is to enhance the story and to clear up confusion. If you present an idea to someone and they ask, okay, well, what about this? That's not you failed to tell me the story. That's this needs a little clarification. That's constructive criticism. That's them saying, I like this, but this needs to be clarified.
Or they can even help you expound on an idea you had.
Right.
Like, Joster helped me build this entire space anomaly. And I had no idea it was going to be a space anomaly. I just knew I knew what was happening on this certain planet, and I didn't know why it was happening. But it was like a giant electrical storm that made absolutely no sense to me, but I knew it was happening. So I talked to him about it. I was like, I have this storm, this is what's happening with it. And he was like, oh, well, what if it's this? What if it's this? And we talked about it until something made sense to me.
Right.
It doesn't have to be their idea. Work it out until it makes sense to you and goes with your story. Don't be afraid to reject someone else's ideas when they present them to you.
Right. Don't be afraid to reject them. Don't be afraid to accept them. Do what feels right for your story. Some of the things that you and I have talked about, you haven't taken, you haven't used, and that's okay, because I can take them and I can use them in my own books.
Mm-hmm. Also, don't be afraid to drop one of your own ideas if it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like, even if you absolutely love the idea, but you cannot make it fit right in your novel, keep it, but take it out of the story. Just keep it on a side thing where you might be able to possibly use it later.
I was actually talking to my sister today, and I had her just look over the first little bit of a story that I started writing recently, and she was like, "This is really good, but you haven't really put a lot of description in at all." And I was like, "Oh yeah, well, I'm not really much for description. I'm more for action and conversations and stuff." And she's like, "Yeah, well, if it was me, it would be all description." So, and so it's nice to have another point of view from someone who writes differently from you, because they might see something that you're missing that you didn't know was missing.
Right. One important thing, and this is getting into the superstitious territory. But it actually works. I've tested it. I've tried it. One of the things that you can do is you can get a pen that is your pen and nobody else touches it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I went through an anthropology course where he went over basic, not superstitious, but belief systems that people had. And one of the things that we did was we made our own stone knives and things like that. And it was a really fun class, but one of the things that he talked about is there is innate energy and magic in items. And the more you use something, the more connected you are to it. But if somebody else touches it, it starts to bond to that. So, and I don't want to take this into the scientific realm and completely destroy that philosophy, because it really can't be explained scientifically, but there is an aspect to it where when you pick up your writing pen, you are now in a place where you are writing, wherever that is.
So you're saying I should get a 7-year pen?
Yes. Get a 7-year pen. But the other thing is, this applies to your story as well. When my sister was growing up, she is an exceptional artist. She has been published on magazine covers, things like that. She does body painting. She did a great Harley Quinn body painting. That was
phenomenal.
It was awesome. When she was young, she was learning to draw. She was learning to do all these basic things. And my dad was also an artist. And so she would be drawing, and she'd go to him, and she'd be like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to draw this. It's not coming out right. And so he would take a pencil, and he would draw on her drawing, and it ruined it.
Yeah.
She could not continue drawing. And it wasn't that she couldn't continue drawing that drawing. She could not draw for the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Because he had taken her art
and disrupted the flow of it.
Yeah. So if you're collaborating with people, have them give you ideas, but don't ever let them take your story and write it in their own words, because that doesn't work. This is your story. Make it yours. Own it. Collaboration is for you to get ideas, not for someone to take over. So that's an important thing. When you're building a world and someone tells you should make it this way, take the constructive criticism out of that and leave the rest behind. It's your world. Do what you want with it. If you're drawing a continent and someone comes along and takes your pen and draws a different line than you did,
slap them.
Yeah, that'll ruin the entire experience. It's not your continent anymore. It's theirs.
Mm-hmm.
They literally, it's like taking a flag and planting it on your continent and saying, this is now mine. just one line.
That's kind of like when you were talking about, having your own writing pen.
Mm-hmm.
I have, because I've needed to do this, because this is how I focus, how I get in the right mindset. I have one notebook per story,
mm-hmm.
a specific notebook that this story stuff goes in. If I don't have that notebook on me at the time and I have another I can quickly write it down in, I will, but then I'll transfer those notes into that notebook.
Yep.
And every one of those notebooks, when I can keep track of them, have their own individual pen.
Yep.
Because if I take the pen I've been writing my space story with and use it in my planner, I have completely wrecked ever using that pen in my space story ever again.
Yep. Whether or not you're superstitious, you will find that these things actually work. Having a pen that is a writing pen for a writing notebook works. You might do your own research into why. It's up to you, but it works. So we're going to go ahead and kind of close up. So as a final thought, I kind of want to go around and give one piece of advice that you have found like the most helpful.
Make it fun and do it your own way.
Don't think too hard on the details, because when you focus on the details, you lose sight of why you were writing the story in the first place. And when it does become frustrating, that's when you need to take a step back, go do something that has nothing to do with your story, because that's usually when your best ideas will come to you.
I think the singular best piece of advice I ever got was at the conclusion of a writing class, and it was literally, as the professor's concluding remarks, he said, "Now go forth into the world and write." That's it. Just pick up a pen and write. We're going to go ahead and close up. Next episode, we are going to be talking about cultures. We're going to be talking about what makes a culture, what actually forms a culture, what a culture entails.
And how to go about creating those things.
Yes. So, good night. Thanks for listening. And we look forward to seeing you again.
We out.